Well, welcome everybody. Bienvenidos. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Luan Carrillo Avalos. I'm Interim Director for Multicultural Student Services and Programs. And oh my gosh, how beautiful is this room right now with all of you, a full room. Can we give yourselves a round of applause for joining us? Yay! So the purpose of today's event really started last year, and I have to give credit to a former colleague, Emmanuel Macias, who sparked this idea, because the idea is to bring you all together, students, faculty, and staff. And the idea is really to invite someone who is an accomplished leader, who's successful out there, and that students who are from marginalized communities can resonate with. And so I'm really happy that you're all here and learning and engaging, because that's the idea. Let's get together, let's create this space, and invite guest speakers who are here to share their story and share how, especially with their book, how they've been successful. So today's guest speaker was actually recommended by Dominique Vargas. Woo, thank you, Dominique. The Executive Director of DEI. When I initially shared with Dominique the idea of this event, a few days later she messaged me and she said, I have a recommendation. And that's when I found out about Kim Johnson. When I started the idea of planning and inviting Kim Johnson and just sharing with a few folks here that Kim was gonna come, I started to get more excited to hear from folks that they too were excited to meet Kim. I heard from some of you that I've always wanted to meet Kim, or oh my gosh, her book is amazing. And for that reason, I got even more excited, and I'm just very thankful that we made this happen. Kim Johnson has held leadership positions in social justice organizations as a teen and in college, and is currently serving as vice provost at the University of Oregon. She maintains engagement in various organizations while also mentoring Black student leaders and serving as a graduate advisor and a member of a historically Black sorority. Kim is not only a speaker, educator, and activist, but also the author of her best-selling novel, This Is My America. She's an award-winning novelist, having received accolades in 2021, such as the Pacific Northwest Book Award and the Malka Penn Human Rights Award for Children's Literature. She holds degrees from the University of Oregon and the University of Maryland, College Park, and it's truly an honor to host Kim here today at Western Oregon University. We will commence with a keynote address by Kim, followed by a facilitated conversation with instructor Amy Bowden from Education and Leadership Department in the College of Education, and Dr. Ryan Topper, Associate Professor in the English Studies Department. And afterwards, you're invited to join us for a book signing with Kim. With that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kim Johnson.
Thank you. Luann and I have been in communication for so long, and so it's so great just to be here. And being an administrator for many, many years, knowing how at the end of the term, actually getting a bunch of folks to show up, especially students and faculty and staff, is something amazing to have happen. And so there's something special going on here at Western. So I'm honored to be here. So I'm gonna hope I don't fall. I'm a fidgety person. And so you're gonna see me kind of like hoping I don't fall. I might fall, that might happen. I might sit down because then I just get nervous, I might fall. So we're gonna be in this together on this journey. But yeah, it is really an honor. And especially to be here talking to you not as an administrator, because I spend so much of my time talking as an administrator, but actually talking to you as a creator, as a writer, as someone who speaks truth to power, or hopes to speak truth to power in the words that I write. And so what I want to talk with you a little bit about today is my own miseducation of being a writer. And I hope it gives many of you a sense of how we often are connected in a lot of different ways, and our experiences and journeys are our own personal journeys. And then our conversation, I hope we get lots of great questions to be able to talk about my work and writing and whatever y'all want to ask me. When I began writing, it really was my students were the ones who inspired me to write. And much of that was because of how I was a part of their journey. So I've spent the past 20 years working in higher education. And it was through working with them, talking with them, seeing their sort of bright, shining faces about all their hopes and dreams, and also being there in those really hard moments where maybe something difficult has happened, or there's a class or a major or a circumstance that impacted their lives, but then being with them on that journey, trying to guide them, give them the advice so that when they make the decisions that they need to make, eventually, that's the thing that we see sort of on the end when I get a chance to see them graduate. And so it was through that experience that I really decided that I wanted to try something new. And I woke up one day and I told my husband, I'm going to the bookstore because I'm gonna write a novel. And he looked at me like, what are you talking about? One, I don't write. Two, are you just trying to leave me with the baby? Yes. Okay. Honestly, that was part of my motivation. I had a 9-month-old at the time, or, he was very young at the time, and I just needed to get out. And I started to sit down and write. And what I realized was that I was always a storyteller. I just never thought that what I was doing in my head and my daydreaming is what creators do when they're thinking about writing and then eventually becoming writing. So I began writing at 32. I always do this. I spend hours and hours writing, and then I never go off my notes. So students, don't follow me. I just like to interact and be more authentic. And it was when I was 32 was when I actually started writing. So that's the same age that Oprah Winfrey started her show, Oprah Winfrey. It's also the same age that Ava DuVernay changed her complete career from being in the corporate world and deciding she wanted to be a filmmaker. And so yeah, I'm special like them. Just kidding, though that's not why I'm telling you that. The reason why I'm telling you that, especially for those of you that are students and at whatever sort of background and journey, whether you're a non-traditional student or you're a student who came right out of high school, oftentimes there's so much pressure to feel like you are going to know your future right away because, especially those that are graduating. How many of you are graduating? Any seniors here? Thank you for being here as a senior. I know that there's more. I'm sure that there's more, but there's always a question about what are you going to do? And I was a student who, when I graduated, I did know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an administrator. I knew that I wanted to work in the field that I am in now, and I never knew what that journey would look like. But you would have never told me that I would ever be a writer. And the reason is because it was something that I actually always talked about that I'm not good at, or I hate writing. And this is for me, I have a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, I'm a professional where writing is really important in your day-to-day life, but it was always something that I dreaded. It was always something that gave me sort of this sort of sick feeling in my stomach because it gave me the sort of childhood trigger of growing up in communities where I often was the only kid of color in my classroom, or I was often the only black kid in the grade that I was in through elementary and middle school. And I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, just so you know, where I grew up. And I always felt like I had to represent. I always felt that there was all these stereotypes and I had to carry the weight of not only my sort of background and identity, but anyone who was sort of minoritized or marginalized or, stood out in whatever kind of way. And so when I would get to, my writing, I had this sort of assumption that writers just immediately, they wrote down, they had their paper, they wrote it the first time, it was perfect, they were done, and that was a writer. And for so long, going through college, thinking that was the thing that shared your brilliance because of your ability to do that, and I was well, I'm not that because it takes me a lot. And I also really felt like writing was about grammar. I was really stuck on, I needed to know what a verb and an adjective is and all of the sort of technical terms that if you were to ask me right now, I probably would oh my God, I don't even know. But a lot of that really, hindered me. And there's so many stories like that, especially in interacting with a lot of students about not even thinking about the potential of something because you've told yourself or someone has told you that no, that story is not for you, it's for someone else to go on whatever journey that might be. But I woke up, I started writing, and then I kept going, and then my husband was like, let me see proof, what are you writing? And I was writing things, and it took me about a year to finish my first novel. And I went to a conference in Portland and started talking with agents, and I was amongst a group of newbie writers who none of us had actually even uttered the word like I'm a writer. Like I was doing a thing, it was writing, it was on a computer, it did require thinking, but I never said I'm a writer. And it wasn't until 2013 that I was in this sort of like, it was like all new people at the conference come and interact and meet each other. And there was a group of us who admitted for the first time that I'm a writer. Like, it was like that, like very quiet, like that's the thing I do. And it was something that many of us some people hadn't even told their partners that they were doing this, or their coworkers or their family, because it was this sort of very vulnerable thing. And I finally mustered up the courage. I left that conference. I saw so many different people of so many different backgrounds, and we all were like, we're embracing the word that we are writers. And I started and I sent my novel to agents. And that's something that as a writer, if you want to be traditionally published, you send it to an agent. And I sent my work, and I got a rejection. And then I sent 7 more, and then I got 7 rejections, and I sent 7 more, and then I sent 7 more, and I sent 7 more, and that's kind of like what they tell you to do, is like do them in batches, and it's like this slow, painful like experience that you go over a year, and they say it like makes you stronger. No, it does. It does make you stronger. And then I realized that I needed to shift my writing, I needed to shift the letter that I sent, and it was this sort of process where I really actually taught myself what many writers had always known, is that it takes a lot of time and effort and work. And so I spent 2 years submitting my work to agents until I hit 150 rejections. But I was still doing it. Isn't that weird? That's weird. And then I realized, wow, wait, no, I want to be a writer, so why am I still trying to submit this one novel? And then I started working on another novel. And what I realized was it took me half as long to write the next novel, because I'd sort of figured out what I was doing. I, self-taught myself how to do this and reading other works, and then I started submitting my work, and I was getting requests back. I was getting, a much higher rate of agents saying, I want to see this manuscript. I want to see partials. I want to see this full. I want to see this work, and then more rejections, right? So like, it was still getting the no. I was still getting the no. And I finally had an agent that wanted to work with me, that said, revise your work. Here's some notes, come back, work on it. And I felt like it was my big moment. And I took like 6 months, I worked on those revisions, I turned it in, and then she said, you did so great, but no thank you. And it gets better, guys. Like, clearly it gets better. Don't leave yet, it gets better. And so, rather than going through 100 more agents, I actually was called, I felt like I was called to write a certain story. And so I started working on another novel while I was like sending my work out. And I got a call from an agent for my second book, and they wanted to talk with me on the phone about my work and the revisions and all of that. And it was like my first time talking on the phone with an agent. And that was like after years of like desperately hoping that they would like look at my work and want to represent me. And on this call, she was like, do you want to do the revisions with me? And, I told her, like, oh, that sounds great. And no, because, like, I think I found my voice. I've always been purpose-driven, and I feel like the story that I'm working on is the story that I'm supposed to tell. And so when I'm done with that story, I'd be happy to go and work on it. And she was like, well, how much do you have done? And I was like, 100 pages, and you guys, if you've read my work, like if you have my book, it's like 400 pages, like 100 pages. And she said, send it to me. And I'm like, it's a draft. She was like, send it to me. 2 weeks later, I got an offer from her to represent my work. We spent a year working on revisions for that novel. She prepared me to say the publishing industry, it's difficult. It takes a really long time to get an editor. Let's do another round. And I told her, no. I think I was like trying to get back at them with all the no's that they gave me. I felt like empowered. And I said, no, it's ready. And again, I've always trusted my gut. I've always believed in my intuition. I've always looked for signs that this is the timing, this is right. There's things happening in our society that was going on that I felt whoever is an editor that wants to work with me is going to see, like, I don't need to tweak these little pieces. They're gonna see that this is something they wanna represent, and I wanna work with who sees that. And she said, you just are tired of revising. And I said, yes, I am. But I really do feel that. Like, you just know that I have always trusted my gut. And so she said, okay, it'll be a long journey. Let's just send it to a handful of agents, a handful of editors. And they sent my work to the editor, to 5 editors, and the first editor got back and said, I think it's so great, except I don't think it's gonna sell bigger than Angie Thomas's The Hate U Give. And for those of you that know anything about Angie Thomas, is that her book has now been on the New York Times bestseller list for like over 250 weeks, which is, it's not a normal thing for anyone. It's not a thing that happens to Black authors. Like, it's this magical unicorn that just doesn't really happen. And that was a strong symbol of the industry, of publishing, of diversity in publishing, is that the bar isn't even everyone else, right? The books that come out, the bar for me as a Black writer, for that particular editor was, no, you need to be bigger than this particular person. And, so I was like sad, whatever, and angry too. And then, and that was like immediately, that was like my first week response. And then 2 weeks later, I had 2 offers and I sold my book, and that was This Is My America. And I tell you that long story because there are so many times that we see no's. There are so many roadblocks, there are so many barriers. The work that I do in higher ed, I feel like my purpose in the work that I do is to identify systemic barriers and move them out of the way so that students can be successful, but it's a very difficult, challenging thing to do, especially when you work in a large sort of ecosystem, a system that has been traditional and been there for oftentimes hundreds of years. It's built a certain way, and you're gonna experience that. All of us have experienced those avenues where you are applied for a job, or you had an interaction with a faculty member, or you went to a parent or a mentor, and they sort of swayed you a certain way. And sometimes it's really great advice. And sometimes it's just you gotta get past the mountain to get to your yes. And that's a hard thing to do, and it takes a lot of time, and it took me a lot of time to sort of get to the position where I was doing that work, and believing in myself. And when I think about how come I never thought of myself as a storyteller? I started to think about, where was I a storyteller? And, the remnants were always there. I would, sit in my bunk bed with my sister and put a blanket up, strawberry shortcake blanket, and would make the room dark and would tell her ghost stories and mystery stories, her and her friends, when they would have sleepovers. I was always telling stories. Another sort of element that I really think about when I think about like my storytelling and being a storyteller is a very embarrassing story, which I shall tell you all because I just do that. Is when I was in the 5th grade, I really felt isolated. I didn't feel like I fit in. I often was just trying to figure out who I was. And sometimes that came up in acting up, acting out, trying to get attention in a lot of different ways by, disrupting a class or, all of these sort of different kinds of things, because I was sort of figuring out who I was and why I felt different and why I didn't have the same kind of friendships that I saw other people having certain kinds of friendships. And so I really started to think about, like, what can I do to, like, fit in? And, there was, like, sleepovers and parties and different kinds of things where people were starting to have crushes on different people. And so I decided I was going to fabricate a relationship. And I know it's really bad. Let me drink some, it's a bad story. And so there was, like, the most popular girl in the 5th grade. Her name is Lisa. And eventually on Facebook, I'll tell her, like, the real end of the story. But I have not told her yet, but I've told all my good friends, like you guys. And so Lisa was very popular. And I started to think, okay, if I can get a sort of pretend story of that there's a guy who likes me, and he's in the 6th grade, I'm in the 5th grade. He's in the 6th, this is so problematic. He's in the 6th grade, and he's from France, and he speaks French, and I don't remember his name, but I'm sure it was something like Pierre or something like that. And if I can sort of, like, tell this story that, that, like, this person has a crush on me, then I could be the coolest girl in school, like Lisa. And so I wrote like a little, this is so embarrassing. I wrote a letter, and I, like, hid it in, like, the tire swing kind of thing. And I was like, oh my God, this letter from Pierre. And they didn't believe me. They were like, the handwriting is suspect, whatever. And the story, it goes on. But, and so I was like, let me fabricate a call. So I go on 3-way and call Lisa, and then Pierre's on the line, which I'm Pierre with my, like, French accent. I was in 5th grade, you guys, and pretended to, say that I was Pierre or whatever, and she didn't believe me. But I was in such denial of the situation, and what I really just wanted to fit in. And I was trying to fit in a particular mold that actually has nothing to do with me. Like, why did I pick a boy from France who speaks French? Like, why did I do that as a little black girl in Eugene? I did that because I thought that maybe that's what would make me sort of fit in and finding myself. And there's so many of those sort of instances when I think about, like, being a creator and telling stories, and oftentimes it comes from a place of vulnerability, like an ability to sort of rip open those secrets, those embarrassing things that you sort of don't tell people actually, that to expose yourself, because then you start to think about your characters and you start to think about real people experiencing real things and the decisions that they make. And my silly Pierre story was how my brain was thinking when I was, a little girl in the 5th grade, that has sort of transcended to think about, I've always been creative. And I've always been creative. And I've also had to go through a journey as I got older and got into, more middle school, where I felt more solid with who I was, and understanding the decisions that I was making was because I felt picked on, I felt isolated, and I wanted to do a call for, diversity and an understanding of, like, actually who I am and what I'm about is just as important as anyone else. And that silly Pierre story really was, I think, a key part in my journey of thinking about activism, and it was just a very strange thing to say, but but for me it really was, in thinking about all those moments where, I never read a book by a black author with a black character until I went to college. And so you can understand, how not having those images, not having particular stories and experiences had me trying to create my own experience in an environment that didn't necessarily fully embrace me or understand me, and not necessarily, like, knowingly. Right? Like, not necessarily knowingly. Of course, there were times, but not necessarily. And, that is really sort of why I find myself being so interested in access and justice and representation, and being able to really connect to young people so that when I write my work, like Tracy Beaumont in my story, This Is My America, or Andre Jackson in my next book, Invisible Sun, when I create those stories, I want them to feel like they are rendering real life people who have these experiences, and maybe told in, a thriller, sort of fast-paced way to kind of like propel you into the story a bit more. But it's all about trying to be seen, trying to drive conversations, trying to develop empathy and understanding, whether it's someone who completely connects with those experiences, someone who, understands that world, and those that it's completely foreign to them. They've never experienced or never seen anything like that. And that, to me, is my sense of being a creator. That has been my journey of my own sort of miseducation of what a writer can be. And I look forward to never talking about the Pierre story again. Don't ask me any questions about Pierre. Pierre is done. I exposed my heart to you. So that's like something that, I really want to be able to talk about my work and whatever interests you. So I know we have some wonderful facilitators that are going to join me. So thank you for hearing a little bit about how I got to my journey of writing and passing through a lot of no's to finally get to my yes. So thank you so much.
I was just wondering, was there any particular real-life case that inspired you to write this particular book, or was it multiple?
Yeah, so really good question. I've had a lot of different inspirations to writing this book. One of the first ones was sort of the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015, where many of my students, especially my Black students in particular, who were really trying to figure out how they wanted to sort of navigate their own voice, their own, activism. And a lot of the conversations that I was having with them was really so focused on their sense of police brutality. And a lot of it was things that I had my own sense of questioning when, in 1993, when Rodney King, had, sort of the first sort of visible video that a lot of people felt like, okay, this is going to be the thing that, is going to get justice in that experience. And what I really started to recognize was that the conversations that I saw in media, the conversations that were, happening, with my students, that there was so much emphasis on police brutality without a recognition of actually the systemic nature of racism that has its roots that have been developed since slavery. And that there are so many systemic factors, there are so many scenarios that have nothing to do with police brutality, but just even being pulled over, the reasons of, say, being pulled over, or the experience of being arrested, or what does it look like when you're in the justice system. And so that really was a big sort of precipice of my story. And when I knew I wanted to write something that really expanded that conversation of police brutality, is then I read Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy. And if you haven't read or seen the movie that was then later done for him, it really was a memoir about how he has dedicated his life to fighting for those that have been wrongfully incarcerated and mistreated through their experiences that eventually led them to get sentenced to death. And I felt like, writing a story that dealt with what is actually an incredible, painful reality and truth in our society is that 1 in 9 cases that are death penalty cases actually end up being exonerated. And often that takes decades. And so I looked at, this is my long-winded way of answering your question. I looked at many, many cases of those that have been, wrongfully incarcerated and what it took for justice, and started to see that there was such a common thread. Assumption of guilt because of race, or because of their income status, or they were, seen as a certain kind of person in a particular community, an outsider, for example, and a really rush to make judgment a rush to close a case because a community was really terrified. And so that really was where I sort of focused on thinking about my cases. And so if you listen to a lot of cases, read a lot of cases, you'll see, I talked to so many people who were like, wow, did you write about this particular case? And it's like, this is such a common thread that occurs. And I really wanted that to be a part of the story. So I did interview people who've been in the system and wrongfully incarcerated and families and those kinds of things, just to get a sense about their experiences so I could render the story as heartfelt as I could. But that's really where the story came from. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a follow-up question that occurred to me while I was sitting there listening to you talk that relates to your question. It seems to me like your character, Tracy, is an awful lot like you. She's tenacious. And you're tenacious if you submitted to 150 agents. That's amazing. And Tracy listens to her gut and you listen to your gut. And so how much of your life ended up in the book in a fictionalized form? How much of a mirror is Tracy to you?
Yeah, I think that she's a small mirror to me. I definitely was someone who always spoke my mind and pushed through, hard scenarios. I also was always an organizer. So like if there was something going on, I would be at the meeting. I would be, figuring out a way. And in my story, I really try to give examples, especially to young people who are trying to figure out, like, how can I use my voice? I don't necessarily want to protest. I want to do something different. And I model things like writing letters and running workshops and clubs and organizations and stuff like that. And so a lot of that was the different ways that I've sort of shared my sense of things. But what I would say is that Tracy is very much a lot of the student activist leaders that I have worked with, who, oftentimes when you look at leaders, when you look at civil rights leaders, when you look at things happening nationally, people that are speaking up, they're the ones that people are like, why won't they just be satisfied? Why won't they just be quiet? Why won't they just be happy? And they're the ones that are like, no, I'm going to do it this way. And I really wanted that to be part of Tracy's story and journey, and even kind of rub you the wrong way. Like, if you haven't had a chance to read my book, I would say, like, look at that first chapter. And I do things in that first chapter that would make people be like, why would she do that? And I do that intentionally because there often is a reason. There's a level of desperateness. There's a level of, I've tried everything, that then pushes people to go on a different kind of journey. So yeah, Tracy's a part of myself and a lot of the student activist leaders that I've worked with over the many years.
When they told you it wasn't going to be bigger than The Hate U Give, where was it at that point?
In terms of The Hate U Give, or my novel, or?
Oh, The Hate U Give, where was it?
Yeah, so it was, so I sold my book, I'm trying to think of when, I feel like The Hate U Give came out like 2016, around 2016, and I was selling my novel like 2018. So it had already, like movie was gonna be in the works, and it was already, at least 100 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list, so, yeah. And I would say that when I have a lot of author friends that are of color or queer, who have those very similar experiences where they'll have an editor who'll be like, I'm sorry, I'd love to write this, story, but we already have the sort of Asian fantasy. And when you look at books, there's like 100 Cinderella stories, there's all kinds of stuff. And so it's a very sort of common sense of things. And people who've read my work and read Angie's work, they're very different works. They're very different works. I think it sort of is that bias of like, Black character, justice. We can only have one hit. It's be too much. Get them all riled up, so thank you for your question.
I guess kind of a follow-up to my question to a follow-up to your question. When you're talking about activism, what are other ways we can get involved? Like we can sign petition, keep up to date on news, donate to causes, go to protests. What are other ways we can get involved on an everyday level?
You have the list. You said 5. You got there's
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a great starting list. You know, there's a lot of different ways. I think the most important thing is being informed. It's really, really important to be informed. So if you're called to something, if your heart is pulled towards something, you know, that's really where it starts. Because, you know, just going to one thing once, it's where you sort of see things live and die often. And if you really want to make change, I think being informed is really important. And there's so many new ways. I mean, especially when I think about young people today, the way that they sort of navigate activism, it even looks a lot different than the experiences that I had. It's moved so much about what you can do, you know, even online, where before you'd have to figure out like, where are we going to meet, and like, you know, how are we going to get everyone, you know, to this, you know, list, and now you can do so much on social media. And you know, one thing that people, when my book came out and people talk about like, what can I do about sort of like justice issues, and let's do something nationally, like there's so many things locally. Like a lot of things are happening at the local level. If you look at like banning of books that are occurring, yes, there's a sort of a national kind of agenda that's sort of happening and driving and talking points moving forward, but it's happening at the board meetings, you know, it's happening in the schools, it's happening in the classrooms, and you know, that's something that I really would love more people to think about. What's happening in my local community. In a lot of ways, that then it makes it a little bit easier to be able to connect. But yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways: letters, clubs, meetings, talking with people, petitions. You know, there's a lot of different ways, I think, to get involved. So, thank you.
Where do you find inspiration on days that you just don't feel motivated to write?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I write what I call social justice thrillers. And it blends the things that I'm most passionate about together. And the thriller element is just because I grew up and I love detective stories. And because I think I really love detective stories because I might not have seen myself in the character, but I could see myself solving the case. And that's how I found myself in literature. And so when I think about those days where it's really hard, it's sort of a release for me, especially when there's lots of things going on in the world and I don't know how to tackle them, and I don't know, like the problem seems so big to me that it's cathartic to be able to write through different characters in my story. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of my work, I'm working on my 3rd novel now, and it's one of the reasons why my work has a lot of threads and it brings up a lot of topics. And I get criticized by that often because, you know, people want me to sort of focus on like, oh, this is too much going on, I'll focus on that. But, you know, I'm writing from a space of inspiration and feeling like I am supposed to bear witness. And when I, you know, interact with different people having different experiences, or, you know, being with young people, they're not thinking about one thing. Their life isn't one issue, one experience that they're thinking. It actually is a multitude of all the different things happening. They're thinking about climate change. They're thinking about, you know, the classroom. They're thinking about the breakup that they had. They're thinking about all these different things, and that's what I write to. And that, to me, inspires me to push through. The other thing for any of you that are writers, or, you know, having a paper that's due soon or something, is that I think of writing like you're building a sandcastle, where when you're at the beach, there's a lot of sand, and you just kind of have to like start piling it together, and then you work on it, and then, you know, then you build like this castle and that, and then the other one falls down, and then you have to sort of like fix it. And that's how I think about with writing. So if I know that I'm a mom, I'm married, I'm involved in organizations, I work in a very busy full-time job, I don't have time to waste. So if I have 2 hours that the whole family knows not to bug me, I will write even if what I think I'm writing is garbage, because tomorrow I can look at it and be like, that was garbage. But I'm not starting from scratch, or it helps me think about that. So I always just still push through and write. I don't go back and worry about, like, let me fix that sentence right then. I'm just like, let me move forward, because then the next day I actually can go back and I can work on those sentences and I can delete them and move them. So I really do try to push through as best as I can. And then sometimes I just will like watch TV.
On Kim's website, there's a section called Writing Tips for writers. And one of the things that you write, I think, is excellent advice, which is that it's a whole lot easier to fix garbage, I'm paraphrasing, than nothing at all. Like, you can't fix a blank page, but you can fix bad writing. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about a sentence, actually. The first sentence of first chapter is, "Time runs my life." Could you just reflect on that sentence and how that frames the story that's about to follow?
Yeah, and I'm actually just I'm gonna read a little bit more of that sentence because it's gonna tie into what I want to say about why that particular chapter. So that chapter is called Ready, Set, Go, and I'll just read the first paragraph. Maybe the second paragraph. Time runs my life, a constant measuring of what's gone and what's to come. Jamal's 100-meter dash is a blazing 10.06 seconds. That's how my older brother got his monumental interview. I'm not thinking about Jamal's record, though. I'm thinking about Daddy's time. 7 years, 2,532 days served, to be exact. This running clock above my head's been in place since his conviction. That moment branded me. Mama gripped the courtroom bench to keep from collapsing as each juror repeated, guilty. I looked to Mama for an explanation. The empty look in her eye cried out the answer, death. Since then, it's tick-tock. And that's the first two paragraphs of that novel. And I labored over that first sentence of time runs my life, because how do I even enter into this story so that the reader immediately knows that this book is on a clock? And the clock is her dad is on death row in his last year. She's been writing letters for 7 years to free him, and she is desperate. Like, you can feel the desperateness of, like, time is ticking. And I tried, and okay, the ghost. I really try to think about time in a lot of ways, and how Jamal, which is her older brother who runs track, you know, he's trying to beat the clock because of his track, but he's also trying to create his new story. And so I really wanted to think about how to place that particular story so that it could have the kind of energy to sort of, get a reader to be like, we're gonna move in this story. So, but yeah, I labored. I mean, that took a lot of, like, restarting and rethinking it and that kind of thing, so, yeah. And my first sentence for my next novel, Invisible Sun, which it's set in Northeast Portland, I really labored on that too. And I like these sort of, like, very short, sentences. And the first one for that one is, I live in the whitest city on the blackest block. And that tells you everything about, like, this is what the story is going to be about for that. So, yeah.
You mentioned that you worked as an administrator for a while. What are some things that you've seen, like you said that you worked for, like, U of O and stuff. What are things that you've seen that maybe U of O or, like, you as an administrator have been able to establish in the university that actually helps? Because you also mentioned that your job, that the way that you see your job is to remove discrimination barriers for people to be able to, have access to different, like, benefits or whatever it is. What are some things that you see that actually remove those barriers for people?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I still do work at U of O as Vice Provost in the Division of Undergrad Education and Student Success. And, really the work that I do is trying to be a convening body to think about what requires student success. And there's lots of different things, but one of the things that I really try to emphasize, and we have this Student Success Summit that I'm leading tomorrow that I emphasize it there, I emphasize it in every opportunity and meeting that I have, is to think about what are our guiding principles for student success, so that when we think about developing our policies, systems, and practices, that you're pausing and thinking from an equity-minded perspective. And thinking from an equity-minded perspective really calls the question of being very specific and thinking about who is impacted? Like, what are the different populations are impacted by this particular practice or communication in the way that they're navigating? And so some examples of some of those guiding principles that we think about is it's very simple. Our students are our students, regardless of major, college, or interest. Because what I see, at least in my university experience, is that oftentimes it's hard for people to think about their practices and policies because it makes sense for them in their department or their particular unit. And they're not thinking about how students are navigating the entire university. And they're not thinking about, I'm interacting with this person who represents this unit. They're thinking, I'm interacting with the university. And I feel like it's really challenging because when I go here, this is how I interact. But when I go to this unit over here, I have to interact with it very differently. And so a lot of my work is really trying to get people to understand it's not just about you and your sort of wants in your particular unit or service that you're operating, but it's like, how are we as a system, because a university is a system. It's an organizational structure. And so how do we think about seamless experiences for our students? And so I often really try to work with them to think about, a really simple practice, advising. So sorry, administrators, I was like not going to talk about administration here, but he asked a good question, how do you find out the information? How do you know when it's time for you to have your advising appointment? Is it expected that you just get an email and then everyone got the email, so you're here late because everyone got the email, without understanding that certain populations have maybe other things going on in their life and they might need different kinds of nudges and experiences. And last term, they figured out to get their appointment this way, but now they're a different major in a different program, or their credits have changed, and so now they have to interact with a different unit, and it's a little bit differently. And so it's helping these sort of like units understand what does it look like when a student is sort of navigating that particular experience. Other examples of guiding principles that I really try to emphasize with students is really moving away from a student deficit model. It is something that plagues institutions all around the country, and thinking about, there's a student, they've got a problem, oh my goodness, we did our best, but they have the problem and they need to fix it. Rather than thinking about, okay, every student has a problem, but we as a system have particular barriers that are impacting students, and so we need to remove it so that it's not about the student has a particular problem. Maybe we are the problem. And that can be things of like policies that make it easier for students to sort of navigate, or understanding, in your first term, it's a really hard transition. So should we have a freshman forgiveness policy because we know that they're just figuring out how to navigate that? What does that policy look like? It's hard work. It's not easy. I'll say it's not easy, but I think when you get people thinking about the student being more, asset-based with the students, about, okay, we admitted them, so we think they'll be successful. So what do we need to do to help them be successful? So yeah, that's sort of my framing and how I think about my work.
Well, we talked about time in your novel. The other thing that stands out to me is the media, the role that the media and student journalism plays in your novel. And I often think about how just a generation ago, and by that I mean me because I'm old, I had a newspaper delivered to my house growing up. The 24-hour news cycle did not exist in the way it exists any longer or anymore. But the media today is this mini-armed octopus that just gets bigger and bigger. It's a double-edged sword. What message do you want readers to walk away from your novel with about the role that media plays and how we can be critical consumers of it?
Yeah, so, I have a particular scene in the novel where it paints the picture of the main character's brother as essentially guilty, and think about like when you turn on the news and, or you're flicking through and you get like sort of an update, you have like a 20-second ticker or a moment where a story comes up and it flashes through, and then you're kind of done with that story. And whatever that message that's there is a thing that really lingers with you. And I think in the age of, what is fact and what is truth, and the media to me is something that really we need to become strong critical thinkers in terms of slowing down and really understanding that. And a lot of that plagues death penalty cases, because if something traumatic happens in a particular community, people want to feel safe. And so what's a great way to make people feel safe is, we got the guy, right? We got him, don't worry. He's, we're going to lock him up for a long time, and it's all, settled. And like, let's look at this, nefarious picture of when they were, out partying that one night. And without thinking about, like, that's all that's curated. Not to say that, someone, there are people who did the thing, and there are people who didn't do the thing, and there are people that we don't know if they did the thing, right? But how are those messages curated so that your minds are automatically thinking? And race and class play a huge factor, because we already have these sort of messages that are ingrained in us that, our brain just, sort of immediately does that. So I wanted the media to be there for that. I also wanted the media to be the thing that Tracy is sort of like a budding journalist, because I really would love to see a new crop of young people thinking about media in a really different way, or having sort of resurgence of media. That's probably more modern with sort of how we consume information.
I'll ask you a question about Tracy, our protagonist here. I was struck by how many overlapping spheres of antagonism that she's facing through the novel. She has each sphere of her life, actually, and you read a bit of the beginning, even in her family, how she's responding to her father's imprisonment, puts her at odds with family members. In the school newspaper, she's at odds with students. Even, we see in her closest relationships, her friendships, a growing antagonism. With her love interest, as history has revealed, a growing antagonism. So, could you reflect on Tracy's journey through these various antagonism, almost like these overlapping circles of antagonism that she's trying to struggle for self-authorization there? What were you, could you reflect on that and how you kind of got into that mindset?
Yeah, I really wanted to approach this story in a different kind of way, because it does deal with a lot of difficult topics and hard topics that often, is written in a way of, things happen to a particular family member and we feel really sad about that, and there's no agency that's there with that. And so I really wanted to have a lot of ways that Tracy was able to learn how to have her own agency and navigating these scenarios that are really common, of interacting with peers, interacting with teachers, especially when you've been set up as someone that people look at in very biased ways. And so I wanted to show how difficult that actually is, because that is reality. I mean, I think that again, kind of going back to people are like, oh, it's too much. It's like, I know, isn't that terrible? It's like, it's too much, because it's real. I mean, this does happen. I mean, you think about the students here and think about things that they have had to navigate in their life, where it just seems like you just can't catch a break. And I wanted that to be shown with Tracy's story, but also wanting to show not all the decisions are decisions that maybe she would make again. She makes mistakes, and I think it's important to actually not have characters show this sort of perfect path, because that's something that, especially when we think about the core of why I wanted to write my story, is that we have these sort of scenarios where we're like, why didn't they do this? If they acted in this way, this wouldn't have happened. But if you can use shooting of black and brown people, right? You can use that as an example of oh, why didn't they stop? Why didn't they run? Why didn't they sit down? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? As if there's this sort of perfect scenario that would actually keep them safe in that way. And so yeah, I think modeling that, showing that in a lot of different ways, decisions that Tracy makes, decisions that her brother makes I won't ruin it for you, the decisions that her brother makes, that there's a reason behind why those decisions were made, and it's sort of basing off their own experiences and histories.
Great. You called your work earlier a social justice thriller, which probably is the reason that it's been optioned to be turned into an HBO Max series, which we've not talked about yet, right? So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about the experience as an author of having your work translated to the screen and what your role is, and as a little bit of audience background, when Angie Thomas's The Hate You Give was turned into a movie, a lot of readers had very strong opinions about casting, and she talked about how it's like fraternal twins. We're not identical. The movie and the book are not supposed to be identical. Was your experience similar? And what has your role been in that TV production?
Yeah, I put the book up there because there's a couple different things that I did in navigating with my film agent, who also is Angie Thomas's film agent, just so you know. And you know, so I shared with my film agent some things that were really important to me, and when I selected who the production company so there's a production company, then eventually the production company, you know, work with them, and then you actually option your rights to, you know, is it film, is it TV, is it streaming, what is the scenario, and that I really wanted a production company that would really honor the representation that I wanted to have with Tracy and being a darker skinned black girl in the story, and that's sort of like learning from even Angie, who had a lot of you know, challenges in sort of navigating what that particularly looked like. And so I really wanted someone who would understand why it was so important to have a particular representation and how that impacts the story and the reason why I wrote the story and the way that I wrote the story. And then, you know, they all tell you like, yeah, that sounds amazing. And then that doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen. And so, you know, I learned a lot, you know, going through this process and narrowing, did I want it to be in film? Did I want it to be in a series? And I really wanted it to be in a series because there's so many threads. I thought it would be really difficult to tell this. I felt like as a creator, I could be okay with, you know, the story going a different way. But I thought that more realistically, a TV series would do more justice with the threads that the you know the many characters that I have in the story with that. And so I did get executive producer rights, which, you know, means when they do like casting and other kinds of things that I'll be able to, you know, be connected. But the reality is Hollywood is kind of weird, and it's very different than publishing. And they tell you like lots of like, you know, like, oh, you're going to be involved in so much. And then like, you don't hear from them. And then they're like, oh, we sold it to HBO Max. And you're like, oh, that's great. But I didn't even know that, you know, that they were even interested. Thank you for letting me know. And so there's things like that are really kind of weird. But yeah, it's a long road. We'll see. You know, it's one of those that it's hard to sell your rights. It's hard to option. And then it's even harder even when you get all those things to actually have it, you know, go down. And right now there's a writer's strike, and industry is kind of like shifting and changing, and lots of acquiring of stuff. So we'll see what happens with it. But yeah, I mean, it's just amazing that, you know, that it got picked up. So
congratulations.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question. Hopefully this, you know, it's a small spoiler, but it's not a big spoiler for those of you who haven't read it. But there's, I mean, the big racial antagonism in the novels is anti-black racism, but there's a very key moment of a historical murder of a Vietnamese man in the novel. Yeah, could I ask you just to reflect on that choice?
Yeah, and you know, that's where I really wanted when I optioned with a series, because that's a whole storyline. So I selected the location of my story to be in Texas, Galveston specifically. I don't talk about it in my novel, but I selected Galveston because I really wanted to think about what is sort of the fruit that bears a community. And the history of Galveston was that Galveston was the last place that those that were enslaved found out that they were free. And so I really started to think about what's baked into a particular community and history in telling the story. There was lots of different interesting things happening in Texas that I really, I looked at and thought about like what that community, would look like. And there was a case in the 80s of a Vietnamese community that was working in the shipyards, and there was lots of issues between them and white supremacy acts that were happening. And but my story, I really wanted my core story to be about a Black family and their experiences in a community that was, sort of like very racial driven between Black and white, while at the same time recognizing and wanting to recognize that there are other communities that are also impacted that oftentimes we don't talk about. And so it ends up being, a sort of smaller moment in the story, but another sort of thread to be able to add is that these issues impact, a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And so that was sort of my way of trying to include that. I also am very intentional. I write bearing witness, but there are certain things that I don't write on the page. And, there's certain traumas and experiences that have happened with Black people that I don't think are necessary to emphasize and add on, because we know that, and there's ways that I can write my work to touch upon those issues without, I really want to sort of like balance how do I address certain moments in the story and what's necessary. Like, do we really need that? Sorry, we're like talking around stuff because I don't want to like ruin the book. But like, do we really need that in the story? Because oftentimes, it's thought of not thinking about the humanity of people, but the bodies of what happens, the impact. Like, let's watch our trauma porn on TV of like, let's watch another video evidence of this terrible act that happened to prove how terrible things are, when it's like, we already know this. I don't need you to show another sort of like brutality on TV. And so, it's a careful dance that I do with my writing, knowing where I'm called to write, the issues that I want to talk about, and wanting to be, very protective of also, in particular, my Black readers about their experiences when they're reading my work.
For both your book, the cover art's absolutely beautiful. What inspired you to like have all these drawings? I know they were created by some really talented people, so I was wondering what inspired you to create the cover art the way you did?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So Chuck Stiles is the illustrator for what will be all three of my novels. So if you look at if you got the bookmark, you'll see the other cover. And he's an artist in Philly. And if you go to Art of Chuck Stiles, his work is like amazing. So go on it right now and look at it. But Art of Chuck Stiles, and he does paintings and all kinds of work. And my novel was the first cover that he ever did, and so I'm like obsessed. In our house we have like 4 of his different paintings that we bought from him, and a lot of my work I always think about symbolism. I really emphasized with my publisher how important it was for me to have the full face of Tracy on the cover. It's more common now, like if you go in the bookstore you'll see more diverse characters, whether they're LGBTQI character or a character of color or intersection of all of those identities. It's like now it's so much more common to be able to see it. But just even a few years ago, like 2018, when I sold my book and we're thinking about the cover, it was very rare to like find a cover of young adult cover of a black girl on the front. And so I really wanted that. I really wanted the symbolism of the flag. I really wanted her hair braided. I really, like if you look at the handcuff that's in one ear, and then Africa, on the other ear. And so some of those pieces were really, I think, important. And I share like ideas of things that I'm interested in, and then the artist like took it at a whole nother level, and we like vibe, like we're are each other's biggest fans. So which is really, really cool.
Did you get any pushback? I know things are kind of changing with media and books. Have you experienced any pushback related to either the film, the casting, or, for example, the cover of your book? Was there any pushback on that? And then the film industry has been changing quite a bit of stories coming from a lot of communities that are oppressed. How do you feel working with HBO Max and their input on probably like casting and things like that?
The industry I think is really tricky, and I don't want to talk too much about HBO Max because I'm still kind of trying to figure out what's going to be happening there. So, I'll share. The industry, they get things get acquired all the time, and HBO Max has a new owner through Discovery, and they're more right-leaning, and they want more content that's middle of America, and when they did that transition last summer, they fired a lot of diverse producers, including a lot of advocates of my work. And so I don't know what's going to happen with that. They're now called Max, so that's weird. But so don't put that online, guys. So I don't know. I do have very mixed feelings about what that's going to happen. But usually what happens is, you have a producer or the champion, and you work with them, and they're the ones that sort of fight that sort of like battle, with their piece. And there's tons of stuff going on with the industry with the writers' strike and diverse representation, and that, and while we're in a weird place right now, I think, I feel like always went with my gut and my intuition, and timing has been such a critical thing in my life that I feel like the right timing for what needs to happen is going to happen. And that's like a random thing to say to people, but like for those who get it, get it. But those who don't. And with that, and then I forgot your other the book cover pushback. My publisher has been really incredible. I haven't gotten pushback on my cover. They've really been so great about getting my feedback, and that's not always the case. I have other author friends who that is not the case for them, but mine has been really, really supportive of that work, even going through the editing process. I don't see a lot of pushback of like, oh, you might not want to touch on this particular issue, or, and if there ever is any sort of like question where they're like, oh, can you explain this part? Because some readers might not get it. I'll look at it and I'll think critically of it, and I'll be like, no, it's good this way. And then they're like, okay, and so like there's that. So I have a really, really great relationship with my editor, and she's also so my editor is white, and she's very conscientious of there's things that she just won't understand, and she has had 2 assistants, and she's actually hired Black assistant editors in an industry that there's not very many, and she's had 2 of them, and she's worked with them, and that's also another rare thing that a publisher within my imprint would be knowing that they're committed to me, and they've hired someone not specifically just for me, but a part of that work within their team, which only makes my work stronger because there's just certain things I don't have to fight, or that kind of thing. I have received some pushback in terms of my work, and in terms of like some bannings and challenges that are occurring, but I think my name sort of like floats right below some other like very, very well-known authors, and so a lot of these folks who are challenging and banning, they're not reading the work. So they're just going off of names that they've heard, or if something's on a New York Times bestsellers list or something like that. And so they kind of like, address those books. And I joke the fact that my book says America in it, that they're probably like just scrolling down a list and they're like, oh yeah, this is America, let's keep this one. And so my work hasn't sort of like hit that very aggressive thing, because again, they're not reading the work. They don't know the work.
So earlier you mentioned how the first line in your book you really like labored over it and you came back to it. Are there any parts that you wrote like out of order, especially when you're doing like your writing process? What parts were like completely out of order that you had to go back to, or maybe you took one chapter and said, I'm gonna put that at the end? Did that happen with that book, or were you kind of like, let's just go all the way through and see how far we can get?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because I think often people think like you just write in order, and I don't. Often it's more, there's like a scene, and like the first scene that I wrote, there's two scenes that I wrote. There's one where it's like a few chapters in, and it just because I had an image of like them going to her father's car and like the symbolism between that particular scene. But really the first scene that I wrote was a really pivotal scene that it's not one of the last chapters, but it's like a key moment. It's like the thing. It's like the big thing that happens. And that was like the first thing that I wrote, because that's where that scene came to me. And then once I wrote that scene, I started to think about, okay, so how did we get here? And then I started like brainstorming and thinking about the story. And the scene isn't exactly like, now it's not exactly like it was, because I developed different characters and there's different sort of like incidents that occur, but like the heart of that scene is totally there. And that's the other strategy I do with writing, is that if I know a story is gonna stick with me, like, I'm sorry I keep looking this, you feel so left out, I'm so sorry, let me angle. Hello, I'm Kim Johnson, I really enjoy you over here. But I'll point my body and look at you because you asked the question. Is that I know a story is going to stick if I just free write, and I will let myself free write a story for about 20 to 30,000 words. And that doesn't mean that all is going to stay, because some of it is like backstory and me kind of thinking about the story. But then when it's there, then I'll do a little outline. And then if I'm working on a chapter, and say I'm working on chapter 30, and it's like something that has to happen, but I'm not inspired, I don't know how to do it, I will then just skip that chapter and do 31. Because 31 is the one I really want to get to. And then once I do 31, then I'm like, okay, I gotta do 30. And then I'll go back. So yeah, I don't write in order, and I don't necessarily revise in order. I just kind of tackle what's most interesting to me, and then eventually I'll get to those particular scenes. So yeah, good question.
Are you more of a digital person, or do you like a notebook? Do you jot stuff down? Do you do anything as far as your process, as far as it goes in that aspect? Do you have a place where you like to put your ideas somewhere?
Yeah, I am mostly digital. I think because I have such little time to do what I need to do, I'm like, I don't have time to try to read my handwriting. So I really do digital, but I always have a notebook. So I always have a specific notebook, and the cover kind of reminds me of what my book is supposed to be about. And I will find, kind of going back to when I'm stuck kind of question, is that I will find sometimes I do have to step away from the actual screen and then free write, and then I'll free write, and then sometimes that I will pull things from that particular free write to do that. So I do use both, but I mostly write on my computer. And then when, just sort of a writing tip is that, sometimes you don't see or view or read what you need to when you're sort of working on a screen. And so I will often send my work to my e-reader. If I'm editing for the day or writing for the day, I'll email it to myself, I'll read it on the e-reader at night, and then I will it'll look different and it'll appear different. And so then I'll sort of go back and then do that. And then I'll also read my stuff out loud, because then I realize, I can edit it a little bit different. And that helps a ton too. So.
How long did it take you from when you started writing until it actually came out in book form?
Yeah, so I would say it took me about It took me about a year and a half for This Is My America to just get that first draft. And that's lots of stops and starts. So I was still kind of working on that second book, and then I jumped to that. And then it was like another, maybe another 9 months, like working with my agent, how you get letters from like your agent or editor is that they'll give you like a letter, and the letter will give you like broad themes of like, oh, this character arc doesn't seem as, whatever. Think about that, or like, oh, the pacing seems off. So you'll get these kind of like big picture like letters, and then you'll go and think about it, and then I'll do like the opposite of what they say, because that's who I am. And then they're like, oh, I never thought of that. That was awesome. And so then that kind of takes time, and then you kind of spend like another like 9 months to a year with your editor. And that really is because, I'm spending 6 months on it. They give me a letter, then it comes back, and then we go and copy edits. And so it does take a couple years to, work on a project. So, especially for me, working full time and that kind of thing. Although I do talk to other writers who, they're a full-time writer, and it's, it takes some time, to write. And I'm not, there's a lot of, writers who are like, oh, I've got to get the next book out, because it's your livelihood. And I just really want to write really good books, and I want to get better and better. And I want to learn from what I wrote before, and if I miss a deadline, I'm always going to try to work towards a deadline. But if it doesn't feel right, I don't want to publish something that I don't feel good about. So, thanks for that. See how if I shift my body and actually look at you, you guys ask questions. That's so awesome.
I had to write my question down because I will always lose them. So sitting where I'm at in life, at least, I've experienced imposter syndrome and emotional labor as a Black woman. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I'm assuming not to make assumptions here, but like through writing this book or through life, how have you worked through that? Maybe to share that with our younger folks in the room, and just how you've carried yourself.
Yeah, still got it. Still have it. Still, go through it. It's taken a long time, I think, to work through really trusting and believing in myself. And also recognizing that my views and thoughts might not necessarily align with someone else's. That doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong, and it doesn't mean that they're right or wrong, in terms of sort of like navigating my sense of leadership in those places. And, I think leaning into your strengths, I think doing some like soul searching of like what you bring to the table, and not thinking about sort of the other person that you have to interact that maybe is causing this sort of feeling of it, but really thinking about like what strengths and believing in yourself in that way, and knowing when to sort of step back from things that are triggering or make you feel like you're, like, oh man, I'm just faking it. It's like, okay, well, fake it till you make it. No one else has to know that you're faking it. Fake it till you make it. And I think that there's a lot of people don't admit that. And I've always, I think because I've worked with students for so long, and there's a lot of people who want to present themselves in a very confident way. And I actually lean into vulnerabilities. I actually lean into being as authentic as I can be. And I would say that for a majority of people, that really resonates with them, and that helps me get past, because one, then they don't feel like they have to sort of pretend that they're this sort of like perfect being. And then you see those interactions of the people who do seem like really confident. And sometimes you're like, you're so confident, but like you don't even know what you're doing. And sort of like recognizing that. But I would say it still is a constant battle. But I think the more people actually talk about it openly and disclose their PR stories, it does open up the sense of like, you should always be learning and developing and growing. especially in a space of education and wanting to have, an education and a career, is that there's always new information that's occurring. And so are you better today than where you were yesterday? Then yeah, if you are, you're on the right track. If you've learned from yesterday and you're thinking about how to implement it, then yeah, you can do that. So, that doesn't give you a specific thing of how to do it, but other than like connecting with you, that it is ongoing. Find your crew. And sometimes it's a big crew and sometimes it's a small crew of the people that you can like muster up that strength and courage and disclose those feelings of like, every time I'm in this, meeting or this class or like this job or whatever it is, I feel a certain way. Get that out and then come with a plan to figure out how you're going to do it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a short question that's got probably a lot of a long answer. You kind of skipped over the part where you said, well, I self-taught myself how to write a novel, which is great because there's lots of gatekeepers for writing, right? You don't need an MFA. I don't have an MFA, and I write novels and plays, right? So, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how you self-taught yourself to write a novel.
Yeah, so, in like 2012, Twitter was a place that there was a ton of people in the publishing industry, like writers, aspiring writers, whether they're agented or unagented, editors, agents. We're putting out a lot of information online, and I was just like, I feel like I got a PhD in Twitter. Like I feel like that's how I learned how to write, because it was like my ultimate resource, not in the, it was like the quick facts of like the tips or the threads that would teach you like these kind of things, but often then it would connect me to the people who then had a blog or a website that had a lot of information that's there. And so that's how I learned about pacing. That's how I learned about how do you write a query letter? How do you like publish your book? Like how, what is the process for that? And then realizing that so many people that I thought had these sort of like different degrees, were also just writing. Like they were avid readers, and they were studying words and crafting those elements. And so a lot of that was just consuming a lot of information, getting feedback, finding people to swap pages with, figuring out, do I resonate with what they say? So a lot of that, really picked up in that. And now I'm actually in my like almost final term of an MFA program, mostly because I really wanted to learn. I wanted to figure out, because I love education, and if I think about my career in a lot of different ways, if I'd ever want to teach or do different things, what would that look like? And so for me, then it made sense for me to think about pursuing that, but it's something that I never really needed. And in some ways, it can actually even like hurt your soul. It crushes your sort of writer's soul being in some of those programs, because then kind of going back to your imposter syndrome is you have a lot of criticism that occurs. I'm fortunately in a program that is not like that at all. It's been so the opposite of what I thought it was going to be. But a lot of it was just like researching online, which I think you can learn so many things, in that way, especially the secrets of an industry that really helps you sort of navigate these experiences. Because if I would have went on my own without doing any research and submitting to agents and got my first 20 no's, I, as someone who never had the identity of a writer, I could have easily stopped writing. But it was because I read so many stories of, reading the stories of like other authors talking about how they found their agent, and seeing how, it was years of them really, pushing forward and getting to their yes, that really had me think about like, I'm writing because I love it, and hopefully I'll get that yes someday. So, thanks.
We definitely want to give Kim time to sign books and then take a quick break before she does her second portion of today. But before we do that, just a quick note that her next book comes out June 27th, right? Called Invisible Sun. Mm-hmm. So that's its book birthday, and it really matters to authors if you talk up books online or buy the book on pre-sale, because like the algorithm rules everybody's lives these days, right? But definitely look for that. I'm super excited for it. And I just want to say that Kim Johnson is literally YA royalty, and we're so lucky to have her here. So thank you so much.